her with all the welcome that we can muster and the pleasure that we have of having him present the story lecture. Okay, thank you very much, Jerry. It's turning it over to you, and I'm muting myself.
Thank you, John. That's very kind of you. And thank you to Heidi Coombs, and everyone for being here this evening. You know, it's a real privilege and honor. It's kind of touching at the start because there's so many faces, people I haven't seen in such a long period of time, and it kind of brings back memories of Hampton Hall, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. The first thing I'd like to do is kind of the counterpart to what John Joy did, which is the land acknowledgement. And here at Nova Scotia, we acknowledge, and so I am here speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki. So it's the unceded, the term we use in Nova Scotia is in Mi'kma'ki, it's unceded Mi'kmaq territory. And we also, it's always important in the land acknowledgements, we always say we're all treaty people, particularly the Treaty of 1752 that we acknowledge on Treaty Day. So it may come up, some of the things that John mentioned so eloquently in the introduction, and it's certainly a good segue to some of the themes for tonight. So, and can you hear and see me okay, Heidi? Is the tech side good to go? So
yeah, everything's good to go.
We're good to go, thank you. And if at any point, just interrupt me, Heidi, if there's a technical glitch or if my two teenagers, one on one side, one behind me. So I'm here from my home as all of you are. And again, a big thank you to everyone for joining us this evening and for joining me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to speak for probably, as Heidi and I and John talked about, 50 minutes or 50 minutes or so. We'll see. I'll keep my eye on the watch, kind of walk through this. So the 3 points of where I want to go this evening. The first, I'm going to talk about stories, and stories in a very particular way. I'm going to talk about them in my perspective. These are things that I've been talking about, teaching and working on off and on for 25 years now. So this, you know, it's something that I've been kind of mulling over. I don't think I have a whole lot of solutions to these issues. I'm more going to raise problems for discussion tonight. I would never pretend at all to have any kind of solutions to the larger issues, as Ed Roberts was saying very eloquently at the start in terms of what Newfoundland and Labrador is facing. But I think what I want to propose this evening are ways of looking at what's going on in the recent past and ways of maybe talking about the present and the future. And that way, principally for me this evening, is through stories, and a very particular type of stories. Narratives are what I'm going to be talking about. So where politics, political culture, and particularly the thing I'm interested in is mythologies, which of course myths are just types of stories, a very particular type of stories. And I'll talk about this in a minute. And then secondly, and this goes back to John Joy's land acknowledgement and the land acknowledgement I gave, and I know I've been trying, it's challenging for those of us, you know, I haven't lived in Newfoundland since 2003. I can follow social media as much as and read the news and talk to people. It's not the same, but from an outsider's perspective, you know, I know some of the changes that have been going on in just the news cycle this week in terms of Indigenous issues. And I think the second point I want to acknowledge is about what my paper and talk is about tonight and what it's not about. So the context is, and as John alluded to, is settler colonialism. And the context, when I talk about these stories, are the dominant narratives. So this is not a lecture that's talking about Indigenous perspectives per se. You know, it's about the dominant mainstream narratives. It's about where those perspectives come from and how we understand where Newfoundland and Labrador is today. But it's important to kind of acknowledge the selective process. So the third point is what I call, and psychologists and also historians, we use this term heuristics, meaning shorthands, mnemonic devices. The things that we say, and this is where Colony of Unrequited Dreams, which is going to be kind of a touchstone, one of the touchstones for my lecture, the languages, the logics, and really the underpinnings of culture, the dominant kind of mainstream culture in Newfoundland and Labrador, and especially in Newfoundland. And that's a process of, the key point that I want to be making is a process of selection. And selection, of course, involves inclusion and involves exclusion. And so I will be talking about particularly some of the protests in Labrador and some of the Indigenous issues surrounding that, but it's important to realize the backdrop of my talk today is to talk about those dominant narratives and then talk about some alternate narratives, but never for a second to presume, never for a second to pretend that the dominant narratives, the mainstream narratives, are anything other than that. They are exactly that. They're exclusionary. They are, as they're colonialist. And as John Joy said in his introduction, you know, it's part of this process of reconciliations in terms of recovering and discussing Indigenous perspectives, but it's also, and one of the things I want to do in my lecture this evening, critically examining the dominant narratives. So it's, talking about stories, talking about that context of understanding settler colonialism. And I guess you could argue that's what we're doing this evening, is understanding that process and then understanding the selectivity. And what I'm interested in is what we talk about and what we forget. The silences, in those some very loud silences, what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. So I'm going to do some Back to the Future moments, which is a good segue to what I'm going to talk about next, in some touchstones. And this is for me, and before we were getting started, for those of you who are just joining us, we were talking about Hampton Hall, which is the last time this is a slide. PowerPoint wasn't very sophisticated then. This is the way PowerPoint would work. It didn't give you the options of kind of making your slides very sophisticated. The last talk I gave, which was almost a decade ago, in some ways formed the bookend. If that was the kind of the alpha point, this evening is the omega point, the end point. And the questions I asked there, and this was in 2011, which is what happens? What happens in Newfoundland and Labrador when the sun does shine? What happens when Newfoundland and Labrador is a have province? So the context then, and that was the last lecture I gave in Hampton Hall, was kind of asking that question in terms of what does that do for the understanding of a culture? What does it do when you have a dominant narrative of grievance, of struggle, of these long-standing epic battles with Ottawa, or the conspiracy theories surrounding Confederation? And the question I tried to ask a decade ago, and we had an interesting discussion, I remember quite clearly, in an argument or a debate I got into with Kevin Martin. If he's here, we can talk about that. But it was very much of a sense of where the province was at that moment in time. And that's why I want to return to that, because then what's interesting is what I want to talk about this evening is what's changed since then and what stayed the same. And I think for someday the sun will shine, well, depending on how old you are, if you're a Gen Xer like me or a baby boomer, you don't need to look that up. From the slogan from Brian Peckford, you will know someday the sun will shine and have not will be no more. And that's a heuristic. That's a kind of a way in which it gets what I call hardwired into the culture. And so at the start of that lecture, this is the exact slide I had a decade ago, and kind of just had a litmus, or kind of a list of all the ways in which, and the place in which Newfoundland was shortly after Danny Williams resigned in 2010. And while everyone was still digesting what was then not an agreement, or it was just a term sheet for what would become Muskrat Falls. And as the long list, I won't read out the slide, the sense of, this emergence of a powerful new leader, the war with Ottawa, and of course, it then became the title for Bill Rowe's book. Kind of, again, it's something which is now we talk about in the historic sense, this epic struggles over offshore oil resources. And what I tried to do then is to juxtapose that and to compare that with the Peckford era. And this is what got me in a little bit of hot water 10 years ago. I'm not sure what it'll get me tonight. The argument I made a decade ago, and it'll be similar to the argument I'm going to make over the next half hour, is the argument about continuities. And I think, as much as, we had a little preliminary discussion at the beginning talking about how Newfoundland really is, I think Newfoundland and Labrador is at a watershed moment, at a tipping point. You can pick your metaphoric cliche. There's lots of them out there. And there's a lot of change. I see that in terms of following the culture and the politics. But I also see tremendous continuities. And I think when we talked in 2011, about the end of the Williams era, and then the oil prices were still at their height, and they peaked at $144 a barrel, and Newfoundland became a have province, what I saw as a historian and as an observer was a lot of continuity. And the continuity stretched back, especially for my generation, to the Peckford era. And to the manifesto published in 1983, and this statement, that's it's a book that's really full of this very evocative prose. And what I think is important about when I still go back to books like this, even though it's 35 years ago, 40 years ago, is because it really epitomized a cultural moment. Right? This is an exceptional language. I think Brian Peckford was and is an exceptional politician. And I think one of the things which made him such a powerful politician for a generation of Newfoundlanders like myself is that he reflected and he epitomized as much as what was going on. Yes, he led, but he also followed. He followed sentiment. And you think and there this, it's kind of talking about the history of Newfoundland and Labrador, talking about as a seamless web of colonialism, which of course we use the word now, 40 years later, very differently, subjugation and exploitation. And this sense of Newfoundland is this struggle struggle against imminent failure, struggle against these epic forces, whether it's the kind of the natural environment or the epic, whether it's the SS Newfoundland disaster in 1914. That Newfoundland history is that story of struggle, right? It's that story of against all odds, or as D.W. Prowse famously put it, the Cinderella of empire, for those of you who know your Prowse. And so for Peckford, it wasn't, and I have to be careful, I don't want to speak too quickly or rush too quickly, it was existential, right? And I think for that generation, it was existential. So when the kind of the cycle comes again 2 decades later, and now maybe there's the kind of the cyclical wheel is turned again in 2021, I think this is an important moment and an important function that the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society can kind of prompt people to say, okay, let's talk about previous moments where we had this kind of existential debate, because it may be different in form, it may be different in language, it may be different in the details, but I would argue, at least this evening, it's not different in its essence. The other metaphor, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit because I don't want to talk too much, I want to kind of get more to the more recent history, but I want to kind of keep coming back to Colony of Unrecorded Dreams, which I think is probably one of the most misunderstood novels in Canadian literature, and maybe even in the literature in Newfoundland and Labrador, because from my view, it's not really about, it's secondarily a biography of Joseph Smallwood, and it's really a meditation on Newfoundland history would be my view, which is why Prowse's history is so central. But the one point, I don't want to get into the details about A Colony of Unrecorded Dreams, and I'll be kind of using it and returning to it in my lecture. But there's one metaphor I want to invoke, and some of you may be familiar with it, and some of you may be new to you, or some of you may not have even read. I'm presuming you're even familiar with the novel, maybe not. And people of my age, of course, everyone was familiar with it. But the metaphor is history as a leash, right? The metaphor is the captivity of history, of the terrible burdens of what you inherit. And I think it's that moment in 1997, 98, and especially 99, as Newfoundland came up to the 50th anniversary, where there was a cultural reckoning. And I think Johnston, like Peckford and others, kind of epitomized that and captured it. That's why one of the reasons, besides that it's beautifully written, one of the reasons I think the novel was so popular is because it captured that ethos. It captured that moment. And that moment was that moment, history is a leash. It's lashing us. It's shackling us, it's captivating us, and there's no way out. And I think that was very evocative of where Newfoundland was. And if I can bring in a little bit more for Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society, if we can be reference ourselves or the society. And we were talking about this earlier, and my wife Patty and I were there, and John Joyce said that he was there. I remember exactly where we were, and I remember some of the incidents. It was down at the old colony where we had the encounter with the Wolf Symposium, and Wayne Johnston himself gave a reading at the end. And I think it really marked that moment. It marked a moment in a fascinating way because we talked about, and we all had to wear, for those of you who may have been there, we all wore a pin on what we would choose, whether it was responsible government or confederation, or they also allowed us to have economic union, by the way, for those of you who weren't there. So we kind of cheated the system. But the interesting thing, we talked and debated about nationalism, and the late Shannon Ryan gave what I thought was a very eloquent speech and a question after Wayne Johnston had spoken. But I think for those of us there, and for that generation, and I think for the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society, which was a wonderful event that they sponsored, it was also kind of pre-configured or maybe foreshadowed a nationalist moment itself. And what it became then, and a kind of a generational moment in the turn of the 21st century. And one of my questions tonight is where Newfoundland nationalism is. If I kind of lay out some of the questions, well, this is where one of the directions I'm going to go, because this was really a kind of I'm not going to say explosion, but it really was a proliferation, an emergence of a new form of Newfoundland nationalism. It had always been there, and some people would argue that even Prowse was a nationalist in his own way, or Joey Smallwood was in his own way, a provincial nationalist, and we can debate that maybe. But there's no doubt, whether you look at Peckford or Williams or a lot of others, that they were, depending on how you define nationalism, which can be defined different, it's not the same as a separatist, but no doubt that Newfoundland nationalism was ascendant in the first part of the 21st century. And Daniel Williams, who's so closely associated with it, didn't invent it, right? It was there already. And you could argue that Williams capitalized on it and follows as much as he leads. We give Williams a lot of credit, and I think that's important, like Peckford isn't a tremendous politician, but those processes were in place before he got elected. And why I picked this, the Newfoundland Herald, I've got the hard copy somewhere in the bowels of my basement when I was doing research way 20 years ago. It's because then that was seen as just quotidian and typical. That was just one of those questions, like your VOCM question of the day. For those of us who lived through that moment, and then probably most of the people who are on this call will know, that moment was a moment in which there was a lot of discussion about, should we go it alone? Right? Should we go it alone? That was the talk letters to the editor, talk radio. What was that moment? And which one of the things which precipitated then the Royal Commission on Renewing and Strengthening Our Place in Canada, which then issued its report. It was commissioned by Premier Roger Grimes, issued its report in 2003. And it was a fascinating moment in the culture. So my point to transition to the next stage of my lecture is to put that in context. And the title of the lecture is, the end of, or, whether or not history is coming back, the return of history, or where we are we post-history or post-myth? And I think you cannot do that, right? There's no way, I don't think you can do that effectively without then looking back and putting it in a context, figuring out what's new, where is the province taking new directions, perhaps, what doors is the province opening, and what doors is it closing? And I think for me, I would divide the previous era up into three, dominant periods, three generations. The provincial nationalism of Smallwood, and Smallwood, the very last point, if I do a good job with my time, and I want to come back to Smallwood at the end, Smallwood's going to be kind of another alpha and omega point, the ghost of Joey Smallwood from 49 to 72. And then this nationalism of loss, which was epitomized by what, as I just talked about, with this kind of nationalism of grievance. Reached its high point perhaps with the Supreme Court case over offshore oil resources, the battle over equalizations, then the Atlantic Accord, and then the grievances, what it solved and what it didn't solve, at least politically. And then I won't even get into the Meech Lake and everything else, but the politics of confrontation and a nationalism of loss. And then that switches. And it switches in a really interesting way, at least from a historian's perspective. It switches to a triumphalist narrative. When the oil revenue comes in, and it's not from the projects of the 21st century, it's the projects, especially the Hibernia platform from the late, the projects which were started in the 1990s, when the price of oil suddenly skyrockets after Danny Williams gets elected, then all of a sudden, and it really, I do think it is all of a sudden, I don't think no one could foresee exactly what would happen in a very short period of time. The economic fortunes of Newfoundland and Labrador change practically overnight. And I think we haven't yet, and I don't think historians have yet really digested and analyzed what that does to a culture and a society when you have generations defined by have-not status, generations defined by grievance. And then in a very relatively short period of time, you have a commodities boom. And of course, it wasn't just oil, it was iron ore and a variety of commodities, oil being the most spectacular. Then all of a sudden the culture shifts again. It's nationalism, but it's a very different type of nationalism. And the question I guess I'll pose from that is that where does that leave Newfoundland and Labrador today? And you'll notice I kind of cut off my narrative in 2015 because it is very much of this, it's almost like an interregnum period. It's this kind of in-between a liminal period in the sense of it's emerging into something, but it's really unclear. And that's a 6-year period. Right? But it's a long time for the province really to try to make a decision about what direction it's going in. And that's really my topic tonight. So just a few other kind of points about where we were, or where Newfoundland and Labrador were. And I think it's important that involved a rebranding process, which is important in terms of how we understand that rebranding now that we have almost 20 years in retrospect, and where that rebranding is going to go in 2021 moving forward. And just a couple of, my talk tonight is not a history of the Williams period, but I think we'd be remiss if we don't set the context of the Williams period. There's no way we can, if you're going to ask questions and if we're going to discuss Muskrat Falls in the Q&A session, well, we can't talk about that if we don't talk about the beginnings and the origins of Muskrat Falls. As I've said repeatedly, and I'm not the only one, multiple people have, whether it's Dave Verdi, Ed Hollett, and multiple critics, those of us who spoke out in 2011 and 2012, and we got roundly criticized, by the way, for speaking out against Muskrat Falls. It was very much of a political project, which never made, I don't think, ever made economic sense. But it's a lot of mega projects are political projects, and a lot of hydroelectric projects are political projects, but it is what it is. And so two of the key kind of touchstones are, one is this quote, which always stuck with me for some reason, which is that Newfoundland and Labrador is the center of the universe, because I think Williams did capture, during the moment of Republic of Doyle, during this moment of, the high point of popular culture, that Newfoundland and Labrador really was having its moment, its moment in the sun, politically, culturally, and economically. And maybe Williams was more right than he realized. The other point which really stuck with me was the speech from the throne. I'm going to come to the 2001 speech from the throne in a minute. But I think Williams, or the people who wrote it and were behind this, the idea that Newfoundland and Labrador was breaking free. Right? It was become, if this is why I kind of quoted Wayne Johnston earlier. If Wayne Johnston had said, history's a leash, it's lashing us down, it's shackling us. What Daniel Williams was saying in 2009 was saying, no, it's not, we can break that, right? We're not constrained, right? The leash is unbroken. We're not constrained by the past. And I think culturally and politically, that I think was a seismic moment, because it did, as much as it precipitated a discussion and maybe led politics in the late, this is the very late stage, just a year before Danny Williams resigned, I think it also reflected, right? It's both a cause and an effect. And I got a shout out to John Joy. How am I doing, by the way, for audio, Heidi, and the tech?
Perfect. So far, so good.
Because I got a tendency but anyway, if I'm talking too loudly or talking too quickly, just let me know.
No, it's really good from my perspective.
I'm always used to projecting my voice in an audio. It's a kind of a professor's curse. Anyway, shout out to John Joy, because I couldn't find an image of this. So he quickly got his copy from his shelf somewhere, and he took a picture, because it's really important. One of the themes of my lectures is Newfoundland. There's a wonderful quote from one of my favorite books on the French Atlantic, talking about New France in the French Atlantic, said it was always in the making, but never made. Always in the making, but never made. It was a point that always just stuck me. Sometimes you read these books and these lines come out. And I think Newfoundland and Labrador is like that. It's always in the making, right? It's never made. It's always in the process of becoming something. And it wasn't until I moved to Nova Scotia I realized, oh, other places are different. They're not all like that. There really isn't a dominant narrative here, not in that way. It's a very different type of place. I don't know if it's better or worse. I don't think it's that kind of question. But I think for Newfoundland and Labrador, it's really important to realize that this politics of anticipation, it's always on the cusp of becoming something else. And I think Joey Smallwood starts this, and we say, well, it's, the new Newfoundland. And one of the slides I have at the end, one of my favorite books by, and we'll talk about Ayatollahs and Turkey Trots. And again, that book and that kind of form of scholarship talks about, Newfoundland, this new Newfoundland, kind of the new Newfoundland has been around so long now for almost a century that you would think it's been old, but it's this way of constantly reconceptualizing this newness, this sense of Newfoundland is always on the verge. And so what I would argue, and it's the point I have in the slide, that Smallwoodism itself, we can use that word, if you can pardon me making up a word, but it's this way of looking at the world, it's culture, or maybe you can use another metaphor, it's like a set of glasses. And it's the sense that you're always breaking with a backward past, and maybe you could argue that's happening today. You're focusing on the bright future. I know all politicians do that. That's kind of boilerplate stuff, but I think there's something distinctive, not unique, but distinctive about Newfoundland and Labrador. An unbroken belief and faith in industrial modernity, which I think really does mark the dominant political culture, not the alternative political cultures or the indigenous political cultures. The dominant settler culture has an unbroken faith in natural resources, right? There doesn't seem to be a question of natural resources, just whether or not you exploit them properly. But there's a shared belief, a shared faith, almost a religious zeal and faith in natural resources. The Newfoundland and Labrador has been poor in politicians, but it's rich in untapped natural potential. And for those of you who know your history would know, and you're probably going to hear that in 2021 and 2022, and we'll see what the Premier Economic Recovery Team, or Pete, I think that's what it is, led by Moya Green, what kind of language and rhetoric it uses. But I think this idea of this faith in natural resources goes back, straight back to Prowse's time from the 1890s. And within that, the couple of things I'm going to talk about, this narrative of newness, and then finally this very powerful, it's kind of like the locomotive or this engine of Newfoundland history and politics, which is Churchill Falls. which is, and I don't know how, and maybe in the question and answer, someone can explain to me how one thing, one river can be both the cause of and solution to an entire province's problems. So it's whether it's the original Churchill Falls, the contract in '69, and all of the struggle to develop the Lower Churchill, then Muskrat Falls, and now in 2021, what's next? More discussion about developing the Lower Churchill. What had been the Anglo-Saxon route then became, now it's the Atlantic Loop. So what I see as a historian are tremendous and powerful continuities. And that's why I wanted to stress before we talk about the new Newfoundland Labrador of 2022 or 2021 going into 2022, to realize we are participating in a kind of a very deeply, the word I would use is a hardwired political culture. So within that, I guess one of the points that I want to make, or one of the arguments, or call it a hypothesis, I may be challenged on this, but when I would argue what's different and what's similar in 2021, well, I think one of the arguments I want to make, and I'll make in kind of some of the research and writing that'll come out of this, is a decline in Newfoundland nationalism, at least in its separatist variant. So this was shot from late 2004, and it lasted, this episode, and even Memorial University, by the way, lowered the flag. It wasn't just the flag in front of the Confederation building. I think that moment, whatever we see in terms of continuities now with Newfoundland Labrador in 2021, I think it's safe to say that moment, that type of nationalism, which did have a very clear, at one point there was even threats about a block Newfoundland and Labrador, by the way, that moment, which really reached its high water mark in 2009, that moment really has passed. And what I see as an observer is a decline in that form of Newfoundland nationalism, and the threat of separatism, which was there and even the Royal Commission in 2003 surveyed Newfoundlanders and kind of did some polling to talk about separatism. It really doesn't seem to be there in the mainstream political culture. And I think that bears remarking upon. I think that's something that people should be talking about and reflecting on. So the question that I asked a decade ago, and to kind of come back to, so what happens when have not is no more? What happens when the hydro project is finalized? And I think, I was talking with a colleague the other day, and they were reminding me, we cannot even talk about the building of Muskrat Falls in the past tense yet, right? It's not online, right? It's still bedeviled with technical problems. So we need to talk about Muskrat Falls still being the final project as still in process. So it has not passed yet into the era of history. But what happens when this hydro project is finished? Do you double down to another project? Will it be Gull Island next? You've had an inquiry, right? And the question is, what's next? And I've got some kind of answers to that in terms of, that was the question of 2011 for those of us following politics and culture. We knew the question is, what happens when the answer to the challenge of Brian Peckford, when have not will be no more, what comes next? And I think will be the topic of where we'll come to at the end. So what's the view? And let me do a check of time. So the view from April, where we are today, April 29th, 2001. So the continuities I would see, or at least I would suggest or hypothesize, we see a tremendous rhetorical continuity with this going straight back to Smallwood, even further to Prowse, this idea of the new Newfoundland. And I see that in the rhetoric of the speech from the throne, which I'll talk about in a minute. This idea that the solution is to keep moving forward and to keep trying to reinvent. And I know that may sound counterintuitive or paradoxical, but that in itself, right, doing that in itself is part of a long tradition, right? There's lots of other ways to deal with a political crisis. But maintaining that rhetorical stance of the new Newfoundland, I think it's part of a powerful continuity. And then secondly, my reading, and again, as an observer, as a historian, is commodities and particularly energy remain central. And that's, one can debate whether that's good or bad. I think that should be debated. I'm not taking a stance one way or the other if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it should be discussed as a fact that commodities and the massive gyrations and what that does to an economy when you're so completely intertwined with commodity prices. And so I see that as a continuity. And then finally, to do a pun, or to kind of have a take on Wayne Johnston's The Unrequited Dreams of Churchill Falls, is the question of after the inquiry, after, now after an election in the winter, and now with an economic report coming and at least a lot of gossip and discussion about what's next, is this question of what do you do? What do you do with the dream, or maybe I could call it more accurately, the nightmare, right? What happens to Muskrat Falls? Do you forget it? Do you put it down the Orwellian memory hole? Do you talk about it a lot and have a conference or make it a platform on an election? It was not a platform in the provincial election. And it's the question of what do you do? What do you do with something of that size, which has doubled the provincial debt? And that's a challenge, and that's a continuity, and a continuity stretching back to the 1970s. The changes, I would argue, it's the end of the war with Ottawa. And I think that, a lot of these changes and continuities, some of them I think could be positive things and some of them may not be. But I think, there's no doubt that over the last 6 to 7 years, there's been a kind of a very, I'm not going to call it a long-term change, but a medium-term change. And that may be systemic. Maybe the Newfoundland and Labrador's relationship with Ottawa will be on a long-term track. But I think for the Ottawa Wars, which got to the point of almost seeming normative and normal and typical, I think it's important to kind of reflect on the fact that Newfoundland and Labrador now has it's been years since there was anything like, even go back to Joey Smallwood's battles with Ottawa in the late 1950s. There's nothing like that now. And maybe that's a positive thing, but it should at least be discussed and reflected on. And then finally, this is the question of what happens to a political culture and what happens to politics when it doesn't have these heroes or villains. And I think Newfoundland and Labrador culture and political culture and politics, and I think was one of the things that has made it so captivating. The famous, well-known book, which I like, Turmoil as Usual, and everyone I think on the call will know what I'm talking about. It is turmoil as usual, and I think that is it's I don't know if it was a blessing or a curse, but it's certainly very it's very characteristic, or was characteristic. But for me, as an observer and as a historian, I see that as dissipating. It's looking around for heroes and villains in Newfoundland and Labrador today, and I'm talking mainstream dominant popular culture, they're defined by their absence. The bad guys and good guys and the heroes and the epic mythic struggles and outsized charismatic personalities that defined our era, that defined, and is the book that I was going to talk about by Robert Payne, the late Robert Payne, this era of, and again, so many of them have passed, and you talk about John Crosby, that era, I think it's important to at least discuss the fact that that's over. And maybe everyone here today will say good riddance. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a sign of a maturing political culture. And I don't know. That's a political debate about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. What, for me as a historian, I think it still bears discussion, because I think that's a major change in the political culture. And I think what's happened is that the mythic element has been drained out of the culture in a way. And I think, and again, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a positive thing, to make the politics, to recalibrate it in a way that kind of takes out that epic struggle. But I think for me, that may be one of the most salient things that I see when I was talking with Heidi about preparing this lecture. That could be one of the most important points. So the Atlantic Loop, in terms of, and again, there's lots of these, these kind of images and slides are a dime a dozen. What I find is fascinating for the rest of the country, and for Newfoundland and Labrador, it's very different, but in the rest of the country and here in Halifax, what's remarkable is the lack of engagement with the Atlantic Loop and the lack of knowledge. When I teach about this in a class, students will typically know more, and they'll be more engaged about sightseeing British Columbia than they will about what's going on in their backyard. So for me, the stories, and this is where when I turn to the stories of what's going on in Labrador with Muskrat Falls and Indigenous protests, is a story of silence, right? It's a story of what's not being talked about. And so the Atlantic Loop has been important, but it hasn't yet become dominant. It's kind of there in political circles, but it's very much of a provincial, it's called the Atlantic Energy Loop, but it's still really a kind of a Newfoundland and Labrador concept, which is not really discussed much, even here in Nova Scotia. You can go weeks and months without hearing the maritime link talked about, even though it's part supposedly of our energy plan. So for me, and I can't even remember where I got the cartoon, is something I've used in teaching for years. And depending on your age, you'll all remember this. It used to be called the Anglo-Saxon route, of course, and used to also went by other names in the maritime route. And I think what I'm not going to call it skeptical, but I think my take on the Atlantic loop, in its kind of old wine in new bottles, if you will, there's the similarities and continuities are so striking that it almost doesn't even bear talking about. You can call it a loop or you can call it an Anglo-Saxon route, but to me, it's the same political phenomenon in a lot of ways. So, which brings me to the kind of one of the transition points, and because one of the things that's important, and I'm sure this happens in a lot of the lectures this year, is not to slip into a kind of a Newfoundland and Labrador exceptionalism. And I think what Newfoundland and Labrador has experienced with hydroelectricity is a global phenomenon. British Columbia, of course, is dealing with it. Manitoba has dealt with it. Other countries have dealt with it, whether it's China or India, in Africa now. And with the damming of the Nile River, it's an issue. And it's what scholars have called, and sociologists and theorists call, high modernism. And I think it's something which is, for a generation now, over 20, 30 years, scholars have been critical of this motif, this way of looking at development, this kind of uncritical lens through which people see hydroelectricity as necessarily an intrinsic good, as necessarily green, as necessarily progressive. And I think there's been a vigorous global critique of hydroelectricity and a kind of what some people call greenwashing, a critique of greenwashing. People say, well, hydroelectricity is inherently good, hydroelectricity is sustainable because it's part of this high modernism moment. And it's no accident that I have the Hoover Dam there, and I'll explain that in a minute. And I think it's important in the discussion of Newfoundland and Labrador, both of existing hydroelectric projects, and if there's going to be any new hydroelectric developments, to put it in that context, whether it's methylmercury poisoning, what it does to the environment, what it does to ecosystems, and what it does to local economies has to be part of that discussion. So, I mean, this is something which has been going on globally. And I know, and there have been discussions and symposium. I know there's a book coming out with ICER books discussing this, but I think this is part of the discussion which has a need to happen. And in terms of where we are in the language, what I've always found fascinating about hydroelectricity is how it's getting sold. And I don't mean literally sold, I mean rhetorically sold, because you may not realize every time you open a we don't open newspapers anymore. That's again, one of the things that's happened. There's no more Evening Telegram or Chronicle Herald here, we have Salt Wire. But what you're reading online, you're consuming, and what you're consuming are images and iconography and a branding. And the branding is hydro is good, hydro is green, hydro is global and destination, it's clean, renewable energy. And I guess what I would say for you and for everyone in Newfoundland and Labrador, and political people who are politically engaged and politicians, is not to take those claims at face value. They need to be discussed, they need to be interrogated and debated. Energy is energy. And it has to, there's always a cost and the benefits. And typically with hydroelectricity, we focus on the benefits and we have not focused so much on the cost. And I think this is where one of those things that in terms of the next stage of where Newfoundland and Labrador can go, it should be a vigorous kind of examination of hydroelectricity rather than kind of a default presuming, oh, well, it's superior. Well, it comes with a lot of problems. So the speech from the throne, and where where I'm just kind of thinking about the next stage of the talk and the timing. So you're 20. I'm a half hour behind, so I've got 10 to 8. So it's 20 after 20 after 8 there. So make sure I've got to keep myself on time. A typical professor. So the speech from the throne. So one of the things that I wanted to, in the next kind of transition of my talk this evening, is kind of pick up. I know speeches from the throne, sometimes I worry, should we take them seriously or not? It's rhetoric. It's, as I said before, it's political boilerplate. It's the kind of thing where, it's pro forma, I guess maybe that's a better word. I still think they're important. And I think as a historian, they're a really useful lens or prism through which to look at what's going on, almost like a barometer of a political culture. They'll tell you it's aspirational. What a province is telling its people it wants to do. And typically it's going to have language which is within a very good comfort zone, right? Speeches from the throne aren't going to say anything which is going to alienate large parts of the population. So they'll give you a good sense of where the big middle or narrative is, the mainstream narrative. And what I find fascinating about the speech from the throne, it's pretty standard stuff. For a province that, and as Ed Roberts was saying, and for a number of people we were discussing even before my lecture started, there's a common understanding that from a fiscal perspective, Newfoundland and Labrador is on as some people call it, a cliff or a crisis. You can pick your word, watershed, excess, you can go through the dictionary and with a thesaurus and, spend an hour coming up with words to try to describe the fiscal and economic challenges of Newfoundland and Labrador today, particularly in terms of servicing the debt, which is so important. What I find interesting with this speech from the throne is actually it's not that alarmist. It's not posing this as an existential threat. It's presenting the challenges as manageable challenges. It's not talking about cutbacks. It's not talking about austerity. The word isn't even used. What it is, it's a document, I would argue, of continuity. And I think in 2021, it's important to realize, and it's almost May 2021, that you're thinking about where Premier Fury is looking, if this is a sense of where he's looking to chart the province, it's going to continue very clearly within some changes and some new initiatives. Premier Fury wants to make Newfoundland and Labrador the healthiest, that's what stood out to me, by the way, not more healthy, but the healthiest place in all of Canada, which is an interesting claim. So it's quite strident in its claims. But I think what's also interesting is continuity. The realization of the Atlantic Loop, the Lower Churchill projects. I don't know about you, when I saw project as plural, that kind of, I zeroed in on that. But the idea that you're going to fulfill the dream, the unrequited, here's the way I would phrase the speech from the throne, the unrequited dreams now will be requited, they will be fulfilled. The Lower Churchill's problems will be resolved and surplus clean energy will flow. And so for me, I see this not as a break with the past. I see it as a powerful continuity and maybe a wake-up call. Continuities can be wake-up calls as much as abrupt changes and transitions and revolutions. Sometimes doing the exact same thing generation after generation can be just as problematic as having an economic revolution. So what I wonder in terms of our back to the futures is this going to be the stage? So this is after the signing of the term sheet. The Lower Churchill time. One of my students noticed, by the way, has a typo. This is from a screenshot from the Atlantic Business Magazine, but it might have been an earlier version. But the idea, and I don't need to name the names, all the people in the picture, but the idea is this where you're going, right? Is it just one resource announcement away? And will this be the pattern for the future? The next big resource, what I call announcement politics, which I think has been much more dominant in Newfoundland than a lot of other jurisdictions in terms of looking at and focusing on and being dependent on, because it's this craving for the one announcement, right? That one announcement which is going to solve the problems. It's what I call the politics of anticipation, which is so distinctive. Secondly, is the Lower Churchill or Gull Island going to be seen as a make-work project? Is it going to be, I thought it was really interesting when Paul Davis, some of you or a lot of you will remember, some of you may forget, depending on how old you are. I remember when Paul Davis, and it got reported in CBC and the Evening Telegram, that it was no different from the Hoover Dam. And one of the reasons why Muskrat Falls, one of the arguments I'm going to make is that Muskrat Falls is a shapeshifter. Muskrat Falls is a shapeshifter because over the last 20 years in the Lower Churchill, it's been called so many different things, and it's been rationalized and justified and criticized in lots of different ways. And I thought it was interesting because in 2015, after the end of the boom in oil and commodity prices and the drop in the price of oil, there was a need to have a new justification for Muskrat Falls. And that new justification was jobs, employment, and infrastructure. That's a very different infrastructure. That's a very different reason to spend $14 billion than to create a surplus of power and to sell it to New England or Nova Scotia. In other words, the reasons for the project changed. And that's normal. That happens, I guess, especially the project which takes so long, right? The term sheet was announced in 2010, 2021, 11 years later, still not built. And I think it is interesting. So is that where you're going? If you have an economic downturn, do you then build Gull Island as a way to save the economy? What people call doubling down. So I don't know, it's a question. Or is this the future? And this is from a, I don't know, it was an op-ed or editorial, I think it was an editorial by Russell Rangersky, who I have a lot of respect for. And it was quite early, this was in 2016. So you think, well, this sounds like yesterday. This wasn't. And Russell Rangersky was kind of identifying, and before other people, I think, had really realized the depth and the scale. And this is something that Ed Holland had been talking about in bond papers for years, really trying to get people's attention about the fiscal crisis. Then all of a sudden, boom, in 2016, this moment came, this fear with the initial signals of some budgetary cuts. Popular protest erupted, which I hadn't really seen on that scale before. And then Russell Rangersky, one of the most influential columnists, wrote, and I can still remember rubbing my eyes when I read it, saying, get out if you can. Right? And talk about a whiplash. You go from, in being the center of the universe in 2007, but less than 10 years later, the newspaper of record, the opinion papers are telling you to get out, right? And so it's this tremendous, where, and again, turmoil as usual, this tremendous sense of destabilization, of dislocation, right? Of crisis then becoming normative. And the question for us tonight, is that where the province is going, right? Is it going to be a return to austerity? My reading of the speech from the throne is not signaling austerity, but there's a lot of theories about what the Premier's economic recovery team is going to report, and what that's going to be used. And we've gone through a similar process here in Nova Scotia. It's different in a lot of ways with the Iverney report, and a lot of discussion from the previous Premier, Stephen McNeil, and a lot of debates, and you may have read or talked about in terms of austerity. So we have a lot of experience here in Nova Scotia about these kind of political debates. And so I just want to identify the alternate political narratives, and especially before I get accused of ignoring them, where they're there. My lecture tonight is about dominant political narratives. I could spend the whole hour or 90 minutes talking about alternative ones, but I just want to kind of talk about the other narrative, which is there always. You see it in the newspapers like The Independent. You see it all the time in terms of scholarships, people involved in social justice movements, and especially with Indigenous activism. And I think you have this moment in 2016, 17, and 18, where there really was a strong attack on Nalcor, which is almost dissipated, which I don't really understand. It's as if there's less debate on Nalcor than there had been. But the idea, the focus was on a democratic deficit. And if you look at all the things that have survived the Muskrat Falls debacle, what Stan Marshall himself called a boondoggle, Nalcor survives in various forms. And I think that one of the discussions of the debates about Nalcor and what to do with Nalcor and its successors, and one of the kind of the problems with this is whether or not, maybe for tonight, I could have retitled my talk as, the politics of fatigue. When you get in such a relatively short period of time, so many kind of crises cascading on one another, when you go from prosperity, from boom to bust in such a short period of time, there's a cost to be paid in terms of political engagement. And I think we saw that in the last election. Which brings me to the other alternative narrative, which I know has never been forgotten, but the mainstream media, the dominant narrative, it was been written out. I mean, it's there, it's still there, it depends. I know it's back in the news this week with the renaming, or the discussions to rename Red Indian Lake and other, presumably this will be part of a broader process of reconciliation in Newfoundland and Labrador that John Joy alluded to at the start of my talk. But I think it's important that we're dealing with in October 2016, a really different kind of narrative, a narrative that involved a hunger strike, and it involved a kind of a protest, both in Ottawa, it wasn't just a protest in Labrador, a protest in Ottawa that gained international attention. And it involved people incarcerated, and involved a really, for me, a deeply troubling concern about freedom of the press and freedom of speech, particularly around how Justin Brake was treated. And for me, the question now in 2021 is, where did these stories go? They happened, they're still happening in various ways. And the question is, how do they get integrated? How do they get disseminated? How do they get kind of understood and digested within the dominant political narratives? How do they get addressed by the mainstream political parties? Because they are there, and they're there in various forms, but there's still alternate narratives. And I think it's a question to me in terms of how these narratives, right? My point is, how do these narratives, think of them as threads, how will these narratives tie up with and link up with the other ones? Or maybe they'll get lost. And I think there is a real risk of that. And of course, the most important one for the people who live there is Muskrat Falls and Churchill Falls is a place. It's a backyard, it's a home. And I think one of the troubling aspects of Newfoundland, and I'm going to say Newfoundland very deliberately, it's Newfoundland politics, not politics of Newfoundland and Labrador, is at Muskrat Falls. Remember at the big talk of my lecture, I talked about heuristics. Heuristics are mnemonic devices, right? Heuristics are mnemonic devices, meaning that they're shorthands. Muskrat Falls has become a shorthand now for economic imperatives or for the electricity rates, the common understanding is going to double electricity rates, or for, the $1 billion, the billions, 13, 14, whatever it'll come. We don't know yet what the final bill will be. Certainly north of 12 or 13 billion dollars. Those things are all important, obviously, but it's also a place, right? It's a home. And I think understanding both Muskrat Falls when it comes fully online, because it's not yet fully online in terms of the Atlantic Loop grid and the security and safety of that and the environmental concerns, especially around methyl mercury, but also flooding in places like Mud Lake, but also then the planning for the next, or if there is going to be a next Gull Island. For me, the fear is then that you could plan for another hydroelectric development of one sort or another and not to integrate the lived experiences, the ongoing experiences. So those are the alternate narratives. So my conclusions, and how am I doing for time? I think I'm doing okay.
You're doing great. Yeah.
I'm doing fine. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of move into 3 or 4 points. I got 3 conclusions. As you know, professors are quite stereotypical. We always like to put things in 3s. And then I've got one final point, if you can bear with me. And I will really welcome the questions that Heidi will moderate. So the conclusion number 1, and this is a photo of, some of you may be there, you may see the back of your head in this shot. This is from Memorial University, as you'll know, and that's Stan Marshall giving an update on the Muskrat Falls project. And what I find fascinating about Churchill Falls in general, and maybe it's just me, but I find it interesting about Muskrat Falls in particular, is that it really is a shapeshifter. And in saying that, I'm not, I know it's easy to be an armchair critic, but I'm not saying that to be critical. I'm just saying that that's an observation. And the observation is this: Muskrat Falls has been so many different things: a dream, a nightmare, a friend, an enemy, green energy, ecological disaster, methyl mercury, a boondoggle. It wasn't governed. Then Stan Rogers said it was the most over-governed project ever. That's his words, not mine. And now, in April 2021, it's now called a global destination, which again, kind of jumped out at me. It's a global destination. Newfoundland and Labrador is a global destination, and the Churchill River is now a global destination for sustainable energy. That's a lot of things for one river to do. It's a lot of things for one river to be. And I think it really is, as I said in the article I wrote in 2012, a river runs through it. Newfoundland nationalism runs through. It's the alpha and omega point of Newfoundland political culture. It's the cause of and solution to the province's political problems. And it really is. Maybe there's a more eloquent word to put or to use, but I think it has to be understood as a shapeshifter, because if you try to pin it down as one thing, and as I said this to Heidi and John when we were talking, one of my frustrations, if you debate Muskrat Falls in economic terms, you're going to lose in a way, because it was not built for economic reasons. One of the frustrations, the eloquent and amazing analyses I've read by people taking an economic, an engineering, an environmental assessment, people who really did the amazing work to parse, deconstruct, and look at and talk about how Muskrat Falls did make economic sense. The problem with that is that only gets you so far. When you have something that wasn't built for economic reasons, you can't understand it, right? Through a failure of those reasons, because it wasn't built for those reasons. It was built for political reasons, which again, a lot of mega projects are, but I think we have a false understanding of what it is. And it really is that shapeshifter. I put this in as my father's favorite painter, Salvador Dali. So I had to have a shout out for Dad. And I wanted to put a term in there, and it's probably come up in the Historical Society lectures throughout the year. It's a term historians use a lot. And recently I've used it when I've been involved in the debate about John A. Macdonald We're renaming schools here, by the way. There's a school in Tantallon that's now being renamed. I don't know when this will, or if this will come. I went to McDonald Drive, elementary and junior high. So I wonder, maybe that school will be renamed. And so presentism has been part of that debate about renaming statutes, renaming schools all across the country, right? And PEI now is debating whether or not they're going to take down their statue in Charlottetown that you may have visited. And I know there's been a bit of a debate about the statue of Gaspard Court-Real in front of Confederation Building, for example. There's parts and parcel of that. And a part of the ways in which the debates around monuments and statutes gets understood is presentism. And presentism is when you look at the past, as E.H. Carr famously said, you can only see the past through the eyes of the present. But presentism is when you distort the past, you impose on the past your own value system, your own belief. Right? You don't respect, as David Lowenthal said. He said famously, the past is the late David Lowenthal, the past is a foreign country, right? It's different. So presentism is this kind of notion that you're reading into the past what you want, you're judging people in the past according to your values. And, we can talk about that in the Q&A, and I have some kind of reservations about that critique anyway. Psychologists would tell you presentism works the other way though. And historians typically don't see the other way. The other direction for presentism is we tend to see, presentism is when we see the future through the eyes of the present. So when we imagine what it'll be like 5 or 10 years or 20 years, or even next year, and especially during the global pandemic, we see this a lot where we're imagining our future and we're seeing it through the eyes of the present. My point, and the second final point, penultimate point for the lecture, is that creates distortions, right? It creates distortions. And I think and you say, well, Jerry, can we give me a particular example? Here's one example, and it goes from the kind of the alpha to the omega point. Why, how do we understand the contract in 1969? Energy prices. Energy prices are historically low and stable. No one knew, right? No one knew about the wars, the Yom Kippur War, the unrest in the Middle East, the OPEC embargo, the skyrocketing energy prices. No one in 66, 67, 68, 69, no one knew where oil prices were going. And someone could say it's unfair to kind of say that they had a crystal ball and they would know. Similarly, who would have known that oil prices would have skyrocketed as they did so quickly, going right up to $144 a barrel and then plunge again, where we know that they gyrate and change, but at that time, at that moment, like the housing crisis. So presentism is important, is when you're making strategic or geopolitical, and in the case of Newfoundland, long-term economic policies based on where you are now. And this can go for energy prices, and especially for Newfoundland and Labrador, it's interest rates. If interest rates go up or down or whatever they're going to go, and whether or not what happens with the bond market and the ability to sell your debt, that is going to be one of the biggest predictors of the fiscal ability of the province. And kind of predicting financial markets and predicting the price of oil is, it's as difficult as predicting a whole series of other variables. And it's important. This is where presentism comes into mind and comes into play, not to have the hubris of think, oh, well, in the late 60s, they were just, they were just idiots and they didn't know what they were doing. Oh, a decade ago, they didn't know what they were doing. We know better. Well, there were a lot of smart people, as Ed Roberts can tell you, in the 1960s, and there were a lot of smart people in the 2000s. And a lot of very brilliant people worked on these projects. And I think it's important to have perhaps a little bit of kind of a pause in terms of understanding the powerful role of presentism in the future. So finally, and this is where I promised I would go, a book I would recommend to everyone, a book that I had to take a picture of it myself because I couldn't find a version online. And it really sums up this era. It sums up the election, the famous provincial elections, so Don Jamieson, John Crosby, and of course, Brian Peckford in the picture. And it really kind of talked about this rhetoric. And what I like about the book, a number of things, and of course, the New Newfoundland is there. And this is in 1978-79, still talking about the New Newfoundland, right? Two generations after. Smallwood originally used the term, and another 3 or 4 generations before, after Prowse did. The idea that Newfoundland is still on the verge of a cusp, on the precipice of becoming something new. And with these outsized personalities and the rhetoric, which, is just a joy to read, you sit down and you just can't help but be entertained. It's captivating with these personalities, the heroes, the villains, the conflict, the visceral, physical way in which the conflicts and these personalities collided. My question to you, Heidi and John, for your audience today, is this now gone, right? Is this era over? And maybe it'll never come back. Maybe there were products of the era. I don't know, but it wasn't that long ago. Right? Danny Williams was premier. It wasn't that long ago. We're not talking, 40, 50 years ago. It was not that long ago that the political culture of Newfoundland and Labrador was dominated by this type of rhetoric, was dominated by a war on Ottawa, was dominated by what I call populism. And the question is, where does populism fit today? Or is Newfoundland and Labrador post-populist? Is it post-myth? Right? It used to be, we used to debate myths, and Heidi and John and everyone would, we'd have all these debates, especially with the encounters with the Wolf Symposium. We debated all the mythologies, and we say, oh, well, that's wrong, or this conspiracy theory was right or wrong, or, but we were all kind of part of a debate that was about myths. Well, now I wonder about people don't really debate whether or not the myths are right or wrong anymore. The myths don't seem to be there in the same way. And I think for me as an outsider, I think that's salient. Meaning I think that that's something that needs to be discussed. And maybe it's a positive thing. Maybe I should finish on a positive note. And maybe that's a sign of progress, that, those brawling days are over. But I think it needs to be talked about, because those are the days that produced in that era, and the era in the Williams era in particular, and the war on Ottawa, which produced the, taking down the flag and then announcing the term sheet in the Muskrat Falls project. That's where Muskrat Falls comes from. And then finally, the final point is the postscript. And the postscript is this specter, the ghost of Churchill Falls. And I am not convinced that the ghost of Churchill Falls has been exorcised. I think it's still there. Whether or not you need a political exorcism or not, I'm not sure. I don't think the inquiry did it. I think it was an excellent inquiry, and I think they did their job. But I think when I read speeches from the throne, when I read news stories, and there's still the discussion about a global destination for clean, renewable energy, the historian in me, my antenna go off and say, that sounds awfully Smallwoodian to me. And so what you could be seeing in the next transition, and I'm not going to make any predictions, because every time I make a prediction, I'm wrong. But I think if I were going to say it, you could see continuities in policy. You could get another kind of initiative in terms of green and renewable energy policy, but done, presented, sold, and debated without populism. And Newfoundland and Labrador has never had a mega project without populism. Populism has always been there. Everything from the epic fights of Brian Peckford, even there in a way with Clyde Wells, he had his own style, and certainly with Roger Grimes, and especially with Danny Williams, and maybe even a little bit with Premier Dunderdale. But the question is now, how do you have the kind of initiatives and potentially mega projects after that populist era? So I think in the end, it's what's changed and what's still with us. So I kind of leave it there, and that's my last slide. So I'm going to take off the screen share, and thank you very much for your time and your patience.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for providing. That was an excellent George Story lecture for 2021. And just let the audience know, we tried to get Dr. Bannister a year ago for the George Story lecture, and of course everything went awry at the start of COVID-19. So we are delighted that we were able to have him present here from the comfort of his own home in Halifax. Although I admit I like the live lectures at Hampton Hall. There's an energy to the engagement there that you can't replace online. But this was wonderful. It was insightful and informative and engaging. And you've given us a lot to unpack. I think, actually, I had a couple of, as I mentioned when we met yesterday, I have a lot of opinions, and I'm sure we could talk for hours about your lecture. But I did get some questions come in online through email. So maybe instead of me hogging up your time, I'll read a couple of the questions that we had come in, and then we'll open up to the floor. So we had a question from Alan Cass, who I believe joined earlier. I don't know if he's still on. Will the Newfoundland and Labrador government, without the discipline of maintaining its value of its own sovereign currency, always be prone to nationalistic strategic overreach beyond capacity? Actually, before we get to that, Jerry, maybe I'll get you to stop sharing your screen so we can see more people who are in. Perfect.
Thank you.
So the question from Alan Cass is, will the Newfoundland and Labrador government, without the discipline of maintaining the value of its sovereign currency, always be prone to nationalistic strategic overreach beyond its fiscal capacity?
Good question. Short answer, no. And maybe that sounds disingenuous, but I don't think there's anything, none of this is predetermined and it's not inevitable. And I think it's really important to kind of keep in mind, agency and choice, which is a big part of this. And I don't think, I'm not fatalistic and maybe not even pessimistic in a way. In terms of the recent past. I mean, it's, the term, I had a slide and I didn't put it up. There's a book behind me. It's one of my favorite books that I would recommend. It's a good question, by the way, is How Markets Fail. And it's my favorite book on the global economic meltdown by John Cassidy. And it for some reason, it didn't really get the attention that it deserved. It's a brilliant book. And he talks about rational irrationality. Meaning, and it's an interesting concept because he was trying to explain why people did what they did. And of course, that's what comes in the middle of what I was talking about in my lecture. In the middle of that, of course, we have a global economic meltdown. And where Cassidy and others tried to say, well, it's easy for us to judge, but if you look back, they're acting rationally in terms of the short-term imperatives, and the larger outcomes are irrational. And there's nothing kind of inevitable about it. So I guess that would be, but what it does require is, and this is part of the debate about overhauling, Securities and Exchange Commission and the ways in which economic governance takes place. It has to do with process and debate and discussion. And this is from my perspective, and this is one of the things I said to Ted Blades when I did the interview with On the Go. I don't know if it got aired or not. Is for me, if you're going to do anything remotely like a multi-billion-dollar mega project, the very first thing should be is to have an election and a platform. And I think for me, so getting back to the question is, our small semi-sovereign states or provincial states in this instance, Newfoundland and Labrador, kind of, is it inevitable you're doomed to a particular fiscal position? And I would say no. But what it does require is a high degree of consultation and debate, and a higher degree because the margin for error is less. And I think, so in elections, and this is one of the deeply troubling thing, but for me, by the way, wasn't the outbreak and the pandemic outbreak in the middle of the provincial election. It was the lack of a platform. That's what really struck me. So I think that's kind of, my answer would be yes, he asked an economic question and I gave it a political answer.
We also got a question. We got two questions from Jerry Chalker. Great changes in economies from dependence on oil to a green one need a transition period, regardless of what the NDP say. What will that transition look like? How will governments like Newfoundland and Labrador deal with the transition when so much of its fiscal ability depends on oil? I think that was the first question. And then there's a second question regarding the Muskrat Falls problem that is now facing us. Isn't Newfoundland and Labrador positioned to benefit from Muskrat Falls as the North American economies are transitioning from oil to a cleaner hydroelectric powered economy? We have the power. Won't we be able to finance our debt over time as the green economy takes hold in the next 50 years?
Yeah, and I think really good questions. And again, it's hard to know. And I think one of the things, and this is something the specialist, it's way outside of my level of expertise, but all I know is the same thing that everyone in this virtual room knows, is that the Muskrat Falls project was incredibly audacious in its scope. The idea that have 2 undersea cables and then this thousands of kilometers going all the way down the coast and across Newfoundland. And to me, it's no accident or it's no coincidence that it's been bedeviled with so many now. The latest is software, but it's going to, the transmission towers. So by its very nature, so hydroelectricity, yes, in essence, transmitted over stable and relatively short platforms, But what Muskrat Falls, and this goes to my point, in its conception, it's risky. Some of the windiest parts of the world, under the most difficult environmental and ecological and climatic conditions, there's no wonder that it's been so difficult and it's taken so long. Maybe it's no wonder there's been cost overruns. There were so many other options in terms of where, so it's not just the Muskrat Falls as the dam, it's the plan and the conception to create that energy grid, which it didn't have to be that way. And that's why I had the kind of the comment in the cartoon in terms of, this is where, getting back to your earlier question, both excellent questions, the answer in both instances is politics. A different relationship with Hydro-Quebec, a different province next to Newfoundland Labrador, or access in terms of an energy corridor. All of these equations, all these economic equations go out the window. So we keep coming back to politics and political decisions, but in a larger macroeconomic perspective, sure. But we all know is about what's going to happen in 2041. And I think one of the things that there were some very wise voices, Dave Vardy and Kevin Martin and others, saying, well, you know, the big question about Muskrat Falls wasn't whether to build it or not, it's when. And when I was first asked about this in 2012 at the Rooms, I was asked this question and challenged on this point. And I said, well, maybe the Lower Churchill can and should be developed. But I didn't think at that time, with the economy already white hot, that it would be a good time to embark on another mega project. Labor costs are going to skyrocket and inflation. And Newfoundland and Labrador didn't need the economic stimulus. It was already an overstimulated and heated economy. And I think this question of when is another question as well. If you're going to develop the Lower Churchill and Gull Island again, it could be how to develop it, and the question of when, right? Do you go all in now because interest rates are low and you can take on more debt and service that debt? Or is it better to wait? Or is it better, you know, it may sound, for me, it depends how old you are, but 2041 could come, you know, we're 10 years into Muskrat Falls, right? It's only another less than a generation, and you'll be in the final years of the contract. So I think in both questions, it's political, it's timing, and it's taking on the technical aspects of it. And I think the biggest problem with Muskrat Falls wasn't the original dam, right? The biggest, and it still hasn't been solved yet, right? It's the question of the grid, it's the loop part. Anyway, so really good questions. And like most people, I don't have the answers.
We have a couple of comments in the chat. Stephen Wellinet says, I would like to make an observation on contemporary Newfoundland and Labrador political culture, whether Newfoundland and Labrador is a mature democracy, and whether this is an interregnum between what went before and what is yet to unfold. So I don't know, Stephen, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that. It's fantastic to listen to Jerry, but he's sounding too much like a political scientist, a very dangerous historian. We don't know where things are going. I would regard that throne speech as a placeholder. After the dullest Newfoundland election I can remember, and the big question was, what mistake will Bruce Chalk make next to screw it up in one way or another? No issues were put forward. We're still waiting for the Green Report. I don't think it's going to be the end of the world. I don't know whether Fury is going to be able to get a bailout, or whether the Trudeau government is capable of actually making that kind of decision, or it's all going to be kicked down the road. But how do you characterize the present day Newfoundland political culture or culture? It's very different. It's much more mature, still has trouble, real trouble, debating public issues, bringing those forward. And the whole sequence in this election is an indication the electorate isn't to be trusted. Kim Campbell wins, not a good time to discuss policy. And in between won't be either. We have a House of Assembly, which is ineffective at control. And the same thing will go on, and the same hero worship. And yet there's another Newfoundland, and it's the Newfoundland of everything. Memorial's incubators worked. A big deal comes without any government involvement, kicking money back and building a new economy. much too slowly. But what are the politics? I can't tell.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. It's great to see you, Steve. It is, and I think for me, and I think you've already kind of answered your own question or point, but I think it's worth reiterating, and this is where I think Ed Hollett and others, not just Ed, but others have been absolutely spot on. It starts with institutions, and it starts with the House of Assembly, starts with the legislature, and that doesn't make Newfoundland exceptional. We get this all across the country. You know, we've been frustrated in Nova Scotia when the legislature wasn't called last fall. And of course, there's been, you know, no end of complaints about how the House of Commons has been governed lately. But I think it starts with institutions. There's been a discussion of, you know, two different things that tend to happen in Newfoundland Labrador. One is this, and we see this during the Williams era, it's less so than before. We should all be together, everyone together. We should be post-political. And we've had this movement in Nova Scotia, which really didn't go anywhere, which is to have this one Nova Scotia. The idea that partisan politics aren't working, so we need to kind of circumvent that and find another way around. And I'm skeptical, I'm skeptical of that. I would rather see us improve parliamentary democracy, improve institutions rather than try to find a way around them. Because I haven't seen that work in any jurisdiction. So I think the first thing is, as you said, in terms of the House of Assembly and the legislature reforms, the irony is, and Ed Roberts was hopefully still with us, that I think, you know, during those most populist moments when the rhetoric was, you know, as the book says, it's Ayatollah and turkey trots. I mean, this is a great read if this, you know, from ground zero to Newfoundland politics. Everyone, it's amazing when you read this stuff, what they got away with calling each other. You think it's hard now. But yet my sense would be they still had a better respect for the House of Assembly than now, in an odd way. So it's kind of political thuggery at times, but I think the House and the legislature had a place which is really dissipated. And I think sort of my number one concern is about, you know, protecting just the basic governance and structures, committees within the House of Assembly, and really trying to get away from the sense that you all have to be together. To me, you know, when did partisanship become a bad thing in politics? You know, so now we say, well, that's just political. It's like, well, that's good. And so the debate. So it's, you know, to me, so I guess I would give an institutional answer to your political question. And that won't be a solution either, but at least it's a step forward, because I've been appalled. Not to sound judgmental, I mean, I've seen it in our own province and across the country, but I think, you know, the ways in which the parliamentary democracy and legislative procedure just hasn't been followed. You know, just simply call the House, right? Let the committees operate properly, and then we'll find something else to complain about. So anyway, it's an inadequate answer, but it's a really good question. Thank you. It's great to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
We also have a comment from Lorraine. Michael, Lorraine, did you want to unmute yourself, or will I go ahead and? Oh, wait, no, you're still unmuted. You're still muted, Lorraine.
I'm sorry, for a minute there, I lost all of you. I hit something. I do that all the time. Yeah, I'll speak to it actually, rather than read what I've written. Jerry, when you spoke about the nationalism and, you know, and loss issue, I think, and I was really glad at the end that you came to what happened in Labrador with the protesters. And I don't think we as a province are dealing with that. I don't think we're dealing with the fact that they feel grieved, that there's a spirit of separation up there. And because it's a small number, and because so many, you know, the small number, both in terms of the overall population, and then in terms of the Indigenous people, they're in a minority as well. And I do think we need to look at what's happening there in terms of the nationalism and separation issue, and wondering, you know, you sort of tagged it on at the end, but it was so much more important than just tagging on at the end. I'm not being critical. I hope you realize that. Just saying, have you done more thinking about that? Or, you know, would you be inclined to do more thinking about that? I think we have to here in the province.
No, definitely. For me, the education, my moment was when I spoke in Happy Valley Goose Bay and got confronted with this and really had to face myself. And I think all Newfoundlanders do when you're faced with these environments, the presumptions that we bring, the culture and the attitudes. And so for me, what's fascinating and tragic about Muskrat Falls and Churchill Falls in general is everywhere and nowhere. You know, it's something where we talk about so much, and it's there in every political document. And by the way, Steve Wollenitz is completely right. It's a placeholder speech from the throne, which makes it interesting if it's dull, because it gets to your point, Lorraine, the things we take for granted without thinking about it. If I, every time I said Muskrat Falls, if I said home, every time I said Muskrat Falls, I said someone's community. If I use the word community, we think of it very differently. It is a community, right? It is a place. It is someone's home. It's someone's backyard. These are sacred sites. And I think, so the language, you're right, the language we use, embedded within those languages are meanings and colonialism. So it's, so for me, my talk today is about the dominant narratives, and they exclude and they do oppress. And I think, and it's part of that questioning, and it even links back to the economic question. If you say, well, the energy comes from a community, it comes from a place, it comes from a culture, and that comes with a cost. And there's no accident, and you see this right across Canada. Which communities are affected by hydroelectricity? And of course, they're Indigenous communities. And that, that's settler colonialism. And so you're right. And I think that discussion, I think Steve Wollenitz and the others are right. I think that I see that discussion. I hear it in ways maybe it wasn't 5 or 10 years before. Is it enough? No. But it's start of a process. But I think part of it, I guess my little contribution, Lorraine, would be maybe we should start with language and stories. And so for me, it's always this risk, and we get this a lot as historians, and I've faced this a lot, where you're analyzing something and the misconception could be that you're a proponent of it. So if I'm writing about, and some of my colleague, especially I've got one colleague who writes about Germany in the 20th century, and he teaches, and you can imagine how difficult it is for him because he's trying to analyze it, but he's not defending it. That's one extreme example. But for us in Canadian history, it's become very difficult now because we talk about these things, but then somehow we're proponents. So when I talk about Smallwood, somehow I'm a proponent of that. And if I think, for me, it's actually the opposite. I say, why is Smallwood important? Not because I have any fan of Churchill Falls, but to get at the point you just mentioned, to recognize how the language, the icons, the imagery, and the culture that underpins that. And that it is a culture of settler colonialism. Where I'm always careful is within my own boundaries of recognizing I'm a settler too, right? And so, there are limitations even now I can see and talk about that because I'm captive myself to all these things. So it's, that's where, and as you said, it's where you have to be both careful and respectful of distance and careful in what I can feel comfortable in terms of perspectives. But I think you're exactly right in terms of starting. And that conversation has to be, my point, and this is why your question is a really important one, that I think one of the problems is separating the point that you just made about culture, settler colonialism, or methylmercury, and having that debate separate from the economic debate. Because I think that's what's happened. They're on two tracks.
Yes.
And we have one, we have the quote unquote important debate about economics, and they say, oh, and as you picked up, yeah, maybe it's back-ended or it's footnoted or it's something else. And I think if anything, what I would be an advocate for is bringing those narratives together. What I said at the end, not the last part, but the last third, where I said the alternate, taking those alternate narratives of the democratic deficit and of the Indigenous perspectives and the terms, and then bringing that and having that as part of the discussion so we don't separate out energy policy from others. But anyway, and I know it's not an adequate answer, but it's a really good point. Thank you.
You're welcome. If I could just make one personal comment. The thing about Smallwood, for example, that you used your example. I always say, I was never a Liberal, my father was never a Liberal, always voted NDP. However, I always say that we don't look at the 50s and 60s in the way we should, because they couldn't have known in the 50s and 60s what the dollar was going to be worth today. Yeah. And, so when I looked at it, yeah, he made a lot of mistakes in all kinds of ways, but he also had vision. He was too stupid to go with some of the vision he had, but he had vision. But it's that presentism really spoke to me, that when I speak about Smallwood, I say, you know what, there are positives there that have gotten lost because of how we look at it in the present. So I really liked that point that you made about presentism.
Yeah, no, it's really well said. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. We have a comment or question from John Fitzgerald. I don't know if John is still on and would like to unmute himself. John is wondering, what do you see as the future of Churchill Falls once the power contract expires in 2021? And Ed Hollett says, beware that one of the ways of paying for Muskrat Falls is by mortgaging Churchill Falls post 2041 revenue. So what do you see as the future of Churchill Falls once the power contract expires?
And I don't know if that's John, if it is John Edward Fitzgerald, and again, if you're my generation, since John was a very, very important, a good friend and a very important commentator in that era. So kind of a participant. And I remember John sat next to me at the Encounters with the Wolf Symposium. So if it is that, I know it's a common name, if it is that, John.
That is, and by the way, I'm finding your analysis riveting, Jerry, so carry on.
Good, it's been so long, John. I don't, anyway, it's been a fun night. We'll walk down memory lane. I don't know, that's a good question. And I think for me, maybe the biggest, and it goes back to Lorraine's really good question as well. I mean, part of this comes to speed. And this goes back to Stephen's question. I didn't realize until I moved away from Newfoundland how fast the news cycle is. It's so much faster. Right? And maybe it's gotten slower over the last few years, but I mean, certainly for most of the period I was talking about tonight, you will get 3 or 4 or 5, things moving through the news cycle, initiatives, debates, scandals. And in another province, you maybe get 1 or 2. And I think one of the things which I would, say, it's maybe not what you do, but how quickly you do it and when you do it. And I think I'm beginning to realize timing, and this goes back to Lorraine's point about timing may be more important than anything. And maybe Muskrat, I don't know these things. I mean, I do know the ecological and cultural and environmental, and those things have not been addressed yet. But even if someone can defend hydroelectricity, because I was against it anyway, so it's hard to go back in history and say what ifs, but not then. Right, and not then, right? Because what it does, when you look at where because of the cost overruns, well, the Newfoundland economy was red hot, and they just put kerosene on it and a TNT, and it blew up. So if there's going to be any more hydroelectric development, I think timing is more important than anything, and timing in terms of interest rates in particular, and timing in terms of other policies. And I think when you're going through the crisis that Newfoundland and Labrador is, there's always a sense of wanting to have. And I've written about this with the pandemic. We all want solutions now, right now. And I think, my God, the Muskrat Falls, the Atlantic Loop isn't even activated yet. And we're already talking about Gull Island. For me, I would be, so if anything, it would be maybe a go or slower. And maybe that's not a very popular thing to say because everyone wants a fix. But it could be taking time more. And this is one of my frustrations with the election. There was no need in the middle of winter to have an election, let alone in the middle of a pandemic. What's the rush? Right? Take your time. There's lots of time. And I think that's the false sense. I think that's what crisis does. Good decisions typically, yes, sometimes you make good decisions quickly. Typically, you're increasing the probability of making a bad decision when you rush it. And I have not seen the proper deliberation, and certainly no election. Fury doesn't have a mandate yet. So my answer, John, and maybe it's a weaselly way out, would be slower. Whatever it is, slower. If there's anything that maybe Newfoundland and Labrador could need is a little bit of just a breather and see where prices are going. There's oil prices, as everyone knows, could be coming back, and even in the short term. So we'll see.
I will admit, any questions about the future are asking you to gaze into a crystal ball, and who the heck knows what could happen in the future. But anyway, thank you for addressing it. It was interesting because I think you'll see maybe Heidi would want to talk about Dave Coombs's question below. What might even be possible given now what we understand and know about the Indigenous peoples and how consultation, nothing about me without me, right? That has to be a factor taken into account. So anyway, Jerry, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the term which is used, and I don't hear it in Newfoundland and Labrador as much, but what the governments here will say typically are nation-to-nation negotiations. And I think that, and I see this around some of the discussion now about, renaming lakes and other things, but this goes back to Lorraine's point. The discussion and the need around reconciliation is not just around cultural issues. It's not just around whether or not you're renaming a school or anything. It has to be around economic policy and social policy as well. And I think it's mainstream politics in a lot of provinces across the country and elsewhere to talk about nation to nation and negotiations. And I think maybe, and again, it may not result in any, breakthroughs or new agreements, but at least it's a new way of speaking, right? It's a new way of kind of thinking about that. Like instead of saying, must, stay in the Churchill River, if we use the word home or community now and again, as Newfoundlanders, to be reminded that it is someone's home, right? And I think this is always been the problem with hydroelectricity, is somewhere else, right? Somewhere distant, right? You can read about Muskrat Falls and not even see a picture of the communities around that. So it's kind of visible. It's here and it's kind of there and everywhere. And that's why I use the metaphor of the ghost, because it's something which it affects everyone, but yet it's something we know that most, and again, I correct myself, within mainstream dominant narratives, it's not there. I know it's there in the alternate, in social justice movements and Indigenous rights movements. They've been saying this for generations. But anyway, great. It's great to see you, John.
I have heard over the years so many references to that conference, Encounters with the Wolf, and I wish so many times that I was there. I was a mere undergrad student at the time, and it was before my Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society days and before I was a grad student, but I've heard stories about that night.
And most of them probably aren't true. Shannon Ryan never threatened anyone, so I'll say that on the record.
Okay. Paul Hillier, I believe you're still on. Did you want to speak to your comment or ask a question? Or would you prefer I can read it out? Okay, I'll just go ahead and read it. What about the previous interregnum between Confederation and responsible government? Our worst ever, including Oliver Cromwell's crowd. What were the chasing Red Indians up in the bays and the very only ones allowed to make fish? Only ones allowed to make fish. Are you familiar with the post-colonial approach of Declan Cullen?
Yes, I mean, I think, this is where, and that's what's interesting in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I didn't talk about Michael Crummy and others. I think, and one of the reasons I did single out, I didn't mean only to single out Wayne Johnston. We could talk about dozens and dozens of authors, but I think you get in Newfoundland and Labrador, maybe, I would say more than most other, at least most other provinces, not most other countries, where changes will take place and they'll be expressed or deliberated in literature, in folklore, and in the arts community. And so a lot of these debates about, as you said, post-colonialism, this is where I follow the work of Paul Chafe and others. So I think there's been a better debate amongst professors and practitioners of literature than there have in other disciplines, kind of thinking about what does a post-colonial Newfoundland look like. This is something that, some of us have kind of dabbled in and thinking about, how do we understand settler societies and how do we understand it in Newfoundland? And I think the one point where you would see it in the talk I gave tonight is when Brian Peckford says colonialism. And I think it's really important to remember that what I assume Peckford meant, because he was a good, clear writer, is colonialism that was subjected on Newfoundlanders, who are, of course, getting back to Lorraine's point, settlers. It's when the colonized in turn colonize, right? And how we understand the intergenerational, multi-generational legacies of settler colonialism. And I think that's part of a way to create that broader dialogue, which can involve different forms of expression, Indigenous knowledge, and the ways in which different people have experienced colonialism, because it's not something that's experienced by one small group. I mean, if Peckford was right, I don't think he was in some ways, he was wrong in others. It's something which kind of marked and dominated, the world that he knew. And that was his point, is it was time for Newfoundland and Labrador to decolonize. Well, we use the word decolonize all the time now, but we use it in a different way. And so in some ways you could say maybe we're just coming back to the resistance to colonialism and just using it in a different way. So, a really good point in terms of thinking about post-colonial. And it's not a term that there's different ways, whether we used to talk about post-structuralism and colonialism, but I think, some of it can come down to semantics. And if that's a tool, if that's a way for us to get further, as Lorraine said, to reconciliation, maybe talking about post-colonial understandings could be useful. To me, it's whatever gets people engaged and having a conversation and maybe even debating.
We have an excellent segue into Dave Padden's question on the chat. Will there ever be another hydro project in Labrador without full Aboriginal participation?
I hope not. And I would fear, I would think not. I mean, there was consultation. The government of Danny Williams did consult. And there's lots of documentation and writing and literature on that in terms of the details. But the question was, how do we understand that? How could that, be, the agreements that are in place and the negotiations that are taking place now? So to answer the question first, there were some negotiations before. Were they done properly? Or did they include all Indigenous peoples? And of course, I know it's a controversial point now in terms of within Labrador, the different Indigenous peoples. But I think for me, the biggest point of that, and this goes back to Lorraine's important point, it has to be a starting point, right? Not just a kind of an add-on, right? It has to be, okay, if there's going to be another hydroelectric development of one sort or another, it has to be something the planning and negotiation should be part of that. In other provinces, and in here, it depends on where you are in the country, or depends on the country, we have treaty relationships. So the treaties here in Nova Scotia, the particular one that I was referencing here is a peace and friendship treaty, right? And across the country, whether it's the number treaty or and some places without treaties, but in the absence of treaties, then you have to have other forms of negotiation. But I think I think that I think that's where we would be a consensus. I would hope that there has to be a dialogue. The question is, who leads it? How does it take place? Going back to Steve Wallen's question, what's the role of the legislature? What's the role of elected officials? And that's something which, to me, has to be a precondition for any announcement. But the way that it's happened in Newfoundland and Labrador has been the opposite, where it's been the announcement that everyone waits for. We all rushed to our TV, well, back when there were TVs, and we waited, and then we got salvation, redemption, right? It's the announcement moment, what I call announcement politics. And then after the announcement, you get the hard parts of the negotiations. And I think maybe it's having seen it done that way, it could be important to kind of think about reversing or inverting that and have the hard work of the negotiations come on the front end before we make a big announcement of how we solved all of our problems again. And I, for one, you can put me, I was skeptical of Muskrat Falls, and you can put me down as very skeptical about Gull Island. So I would, and Ed Holland, a lot of the people here, Ed in particular got criticized heavily for being critical of what it wasn't even called Muskrat Falls originally, just called the Lower Churchill Project. So I would be skeptical because there's so many other ways in terms of wind generation, in particular solar. There's other, when we talk about alternate sources of energy generation, we're just defaulting to hydro. And I don't really understand why. We've experimented with tidal here in Nova Scotia unsuccessfully. But I think, why haven't we taken, as other jurisdictions have in the North Sea, a long, hard look at wind? So to me, before diving into Gull Island, I'd at least have a bigger public discussion and maybe a symposium or something on wind, for example. Anyway, thank you.
That's interesting, because I've always heard the argument that it's too windy or gusty here for wind. But then I met somebody from Southern Alberta, and they have a lot of wind energy there. And this particular community is the windiest community in Canada because of the way it's situated at the foothills of the Rockies or something. And so if they can make it work there, I'm not sure why we can't make it work here. Actually, speaking of Ed Hollett, Ed, if you're still on, Ed in the chat said that he has a couple of points to make if there's time.
Yep. I don't know if you can hear me. Just give me a second. I'll get my camera going here so you can have the pleasure of seeing me, which is, less of a pleasure than it looks like. Oh, sorry, it's not going to work. Thanks very much for this. This is a terrific tour de force range over a whole bunch of issues. But since we're talking about Muskrat Falls and Churchill Falls and Indigenous people in Labrador, I think the one thing about your presentation that struck me was you seemed to focus on the 2016 protests and afterwards. And what everybody seems to forget is that there actually is a formal agreement between the government of Newfoundland and Labrador and the Innu Nation, which settled a portion of their land claim as part of this. And what occurred in the latter stages was actually what I call the odds and sods. of people who were left out or ignored or in the and were not paid attention to. And in a hierarchy of discussion, there are people who tend not to get paid attention to in Labrador about those issues. But Innu Nation formally supports Muskrat Falls. So they weren't ignored. There was no ignoring of Indigenous people. There was a selective set of agreements. How that ties to the second part of it is the Stephen Wolinitz's comment about political culture and the House of Assembly. I think we're in a phase where the House is largely irrelevant and political parties themselves are largely irrelevant to public discussion and how things get done. What we just saw with the lake renaming is fairly typical of the way these things happen now. And it's the same thing that you will see with oil and gas. A group of people selectively meet with government, the top levels of government, particularly in the Premier's office. They make an agreement and the conclusion is announced and the rest of us are supposed to simply stand aside and pay attention to it. So even the political process that we were familiar with up until relatively recently has vanished entirely. And now we're starting to see more and more of this executive level politics. That's what I would suggest to you may become more common as we move forward. But I think we do have to recognize that there is very little distinction very little difference between the political parties on most major issues. And they really aren't as effective political vehicles. But for the most part, if you're in government these days, you can ignore it. The House is a pro forma exercise. If you looked at the House recently, you'll see that even people who've been there for 2 or 3 days still have to follow a script to get through the most routine and basic things, and they don't debate. They simply go through pro forma exercises on previously reached agreements. That, I think, is part of the political environment in which we're going to operate going forward into the future, at least for the next several years. And that's going to have a profound impact on the way things like Gull Island is going to come about. And I think Gull Island is coming.
No, thanks, Ed. I mean, I think there's a bit of a paradox here, and I think it's something that we see throughout Canada and lots of other democracies. And on the one hand, as you say, Donald Savoy has probably been one of the more eloquent writers talking about what's been going on, the long-term trends with parliamentary democracy in the House of Commons in particular. And so we see this, as we said, we have the debate here in Nova Scotia, and we see the House of Assembly and the situation that you articulate in Newfoundland and Labrador. But I think for me, there's, part of the problem is this kind of the ways in which people have recoiled from, and the way in which politics and politicians has become a dirty word, and partisanship. Because if, as you say, if all those things got rectified, and if the House of Assembly functioned as I think it should, and it's something as a student of history, and I know from the teaching I've done, you look at parliamentary history, it's going to be a divisive, nasty, noisy, loud, right, angry place. And I think, so this is part of the problem. You wonder if it's cause or effect. And I think right now, when you look at it, it's no mistake when I talk about, the Ayatollahs and, these people who are the titans of the history of Newfoundland and Labrador, and these debates which they had. And the last thing I want to do is idealize it at all. But I think what everyone had, and the public in particular, was a stomach for hard debate. And what I worry about now, that we tend to see debate, and this goes back to Lorraine's point, as a bad thing. We scurry away from it. We say on the one hand, we want new politics, we want change, but I think, and we want these institutions to function. They're only going to function if you're allowed then to have real opposition, right? And so, politicians will respond to pressure. And I think, unlike most cynics, I think most politicians are trying to do a good job. I don't buy in. There's an easy false cynicism out there. And I don't buy into it, but they're going to respond to pressure. And so I think there's kind of you ask the institutional question. I guess I come back with a cultural answer, which be the culture has to be ready then to have the real sharp, it has to be an engagement and appreciation, and people have to pay attention. Politicians aren't going to invest their time in question period or anything else if people aren't paying attention. And I think that's part of the problem. So it's, I don't have any answers to it, but I do think we can't disconnect and decouple our changing relationship with partisanship and kind of politics as theater and politics as an art form almost and the ways in which it was practiced in places like Newfoundland and Labrador, and then the institutions. And so I think that there's, when one has to go with the other, because otherwise you're going to have committees meeting and, everything is going to be running, kind of humming along from an institutional perspective, but it'll have no substance. And how that changes, I don't know. I think it can only change with political will and political leadership. And that'll have to come from pressure. And I think this is where, the election cycles and the platforms matter. And I think this is where it was, again, a lost opportunity with the last election. If there was nothing else, and you and I talked about this and others would joke about it as the Seinfeld election. Of course, then you got something, was the outbreak, the pandemic. But for me, if nothing else, to talk about process rather than talk about decisions, and, maybe have an election about the House of Assembly. It's as good a thing to have an election about as anything else, would be my view. So, I'd like the other questioners, that I don't have any answers, but I do think, I guess my only contribution, Ed, would be that it's no accident, I don't think, that if we've had changing views of partisanship at the same time that we've had changing views of the parliamentary democracy. And we can't have our cake and eat it too. If we want a good liberal democracy, is going to involve some shouting, some disagreements. And I don't know if people really want that now. I don't know if there's a stomach for it. And I don't know if really, if that's what politicians are attuned to, that generation where they could give an amazing, even if you disagree with them, for that generation, they could still give a great speech. And I think that's, maybe that moment has passed. Anyway, thanks, Ed.
There is a comment from Raymond Blake in the chat. So Raymond, would you like to speak to that, or do you want to unmute yourself, or will I read out your comment?
Well, thank you, Heidi, and great talk, Jerry. I always enjoy your stuff. I'm just curious. You talked a lot about, as I said in the chat, about freshwater. What about saltwater and fish and oil? And what about rural and urban Newfoundland? In your narrative, these are two different places. And how do you sort of reconcile these with some of the things that you were talking about?
Great questions. It's great to see you. And thank you. And for me, the answer is really the absence. I mean, I think what's fascinating with both oil and especially in the fishery, is that it's become, if anything, it's declined as a point of debate, as a point of discussion, just in terms of the amount of public attention, the attention on social media, the attention on CBC, the attention on the news cycle. So the fishery and the never-ending crises in the fishery, which really dominated the political narrative right up until a decade ago. Right now, I'm sure there's a lot happening behind the scenes, and there's a lot happening in the reality of lived people's experiences, especially in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. But I think as an observer, and this is where it's different from someone who's living it rather than someone who's observing it, that it seems to be less present. The fishery is, I'm sure someone could use sophisticated software and kind of do one of these metadata things, but the fishery just doesn't get discussed in the way that it used to. And I look at, and again, the speech from the throne. Well, the speech from the throne, as someone said earlier, is dull. I think it was Steve Wallens, and that's right. Which means it should have been safe. It should have said platitudes. It should have said all the things that you would expect, as you said, Raymond. And yet, what's interesting is the absence, right? The oil and gas industry is not there in a whole lot of detail. There's no talk about imminent projects, and the fishery is not there in detail. That's fisheries, of course, whether it's crab or shrimp or and a ground fishery or cod fishery. And what I see is a decline in that. And this could be, your question's a good one. And maybe this is another cost of Muskrat Falls, another cost of hydroelectricity. We've become so entranced with this specter, the ghost of hydroelectricity, the ghost of Muskrat Falls has got us so mesmerized that we've kind of lost sight of the other things. And so it's, but for me anyway, that's my observation, is that the fishery in particular, which at one time was central. You couldn't click on a website or certainly open a newspaper back when there were newspapers and not read 2 or 3 really in-depth, thoughtful stories. And right now, it's a question of Raymond. I would say quantity as much as quality. There just isn't as much reporting and as much discussion. And so in the rural urban, I think what I find interesting, and again, I'm an outsider now, is the rural urban divide, the Bayman versus Townie. And for those of us, I'm sure most people still on the call will know what I'm talking about, that heuristic, I see less of that now. It had been such a big the defining point, along with Protestant Catholic for our generation, of how you define yourself. Are you a Bayman or a Townie? The ultimate binary, which of course is, ridiculous, captures nothing. And the same thing with Protestant or Catholic. And I think, that way of organizing as an organizing political principle, I just don't see as much of that rhetoric now. There isn't as much either anti-town or anti-Bay sentiment, which of course, as we all know, could really, determine whether your suitability for premier or not. One of my favorite moments to bring in a little bit of Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society lore is when Shane O'Day got up and he had the audacity, and I'm sure how many people are left will remember this. Shane O'Day said he was a townie, and he got up and he said he was making no apologies for it. And as so Shane was, of course, was so eloquent talking about exactly what you're talking about, is this divide, and kind of claiming that in a way that only Shane O'Day could, and kind of in a facetious way. And I wonder if that's there now. And at least they're in the same way, and maybe that's progress, maybe not. But I think as I agree with you in terms of the focus on the reality of rural life, and discussing and having a kind of an in-depth discussion of how that fits with the fishery, I would say that's declined along with the other things that we've talked about, and it's, at least that's not my observation, Raymond.
Thanks very much for that, Jerry.
Thank you so much, Raymond. We have a couple of comments thanking you for your lecture from Greg Osmond, and Lorraine thanks you for your lecture, which she says connected her on many levels. I think, and then there's an excellent conversation going on the chat between Stephen and Lorraine and Ed, so that's great. I maybe we'll take one more question on the chat and then open up if anybody else would just like to speak up and ask a question. So Zachary Tingley asks, do you think the Atlantic Loop is an achievable vision given New Brunswick's exploration into small nuclear reactors and the current problems with their hydroelectric facilities?
Really good question. I mean, again, the short answer would be, and again, it depends on the political will, the amount of money you're going to throw at it. So I'm sure it's possible. Probable, no. Right? I think the Atlantic Loop, like the Atlantic's Anglo-Saxon route and everything else, as a fully integrated regional grid, I don't see it as probable. And I don't, a lot of it will, of course, depend what the behemoth, what Hydro-Quebec, the region will go where Hydro-Quebec goes. And depending on where you're from, you may, some people in the audience may remember, and then there was a whole election, and it was a fall and change in government in New Brunswick over the aborted deal to have Hydro-Quebec to assume assets and liabilities in New Brunswick. And that had a huge political backlash and a very divisive moment. And so I think you're exactly right in terms of just within, here's a great example, just within one province itself, whether it's the Mactaquac Dam, the Point Lepreau, and the massive cost overruns of refurbishing the Point Lepreau, the nuclear power plant, those challenges itself, let alone what's going on here in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland and Labrador, the technical hurdles are absolutely huge. And the way that I would summarize it, if they still can't get power from the Lower Churchill down through the Strait of Belle Isle, down through to Soldiers Pond, if that software and all those other problems, and some of the, Ed Holland and others know a lot more than I'll ever know about it, the technical side of things, they still can't get that right. And it's 2011. How are we going to get a fully integrated regional energy grid? And I think when you're dealing with, when the surplus power generated by Hydro-Quebec is of such a magnitude, depending on what they want to do. So for me, the answer comes back to politics, and the answer comes back to having a dialogue and discussion with Quebec, and getting back to Lorraine's point, is having a dialogue with the Indigenous peoples of both in Labrador and Quebec, because it just, from an international perspective, it doesn't make sense anyway to have these provinces negotiating and squabbling and running their jurisdictions when you have such an outsized kind of a superpower. When you look at the resources of Hydro-Quebec. So it's, that really defines why Muskrat Falls got built anyway, because a fully integrated national energy grid, it wouldn't have made sense. So it got built, as we all know, political reasons. Anyway, really good question. And I think the history of New Brunswick and New Brunswick's current challenges is something I think everyone needs to be more aware of, because otherwise the Atlantic Loop gets simplified as if just getting the power, to Cape Breton and then it's done. It's a lot more complicated than that. Anyway, thank you. Are we?
Actually, Terry wants to make a comment. Terry, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, just sort of a general comment about, you started with, the history and the stories that are so important to us, and the consistent stories that come up in different forms over time. And of course, the population is so different. I can remember when I started with the Historical Society, or started that memorial, but it's particularly with the Historical Society, we talked about, our sense of ourselves and our sense of history. And like everywhere else in the world, as you say, there's this exceptionalism. We're not so exceptional anymore. We are increasingly an urbanized population. We are increasingly a multicultural population. And, these stories of, how we were put down, for years, this generation doesn't care about them. My daughter grew up, her close friends growing up, their parents did not grow up in Newfoundland. And they complained all the way through school. They said the only thing our kids learn about history is Newfoundland history. From my point of view, they didn't learn Newfoundland history, but from their point of view, they did. They thought the heritage fairs, if you're not talking about how Nan made bread, your kids haven't got a chance. And so it's a very different population. And so the stories, the stories have to change. The stories have to mean something to this generation that's going to be making the decisions in 41. We're not the same people. And you see, you haven't been here for a while, but it's a very different place. Most of my students in my Newfoundland history classes are not Newfoundlanders. And if they are Newfoundlanders, they're first generation Newfoundlanders. I mean, so it's quite a different people. And so those stories that mean a lot to all of us that tuned in tonight and that show up for the Historical Society lectures, we have to make them relevant, and we have to be willing to throw some of it out, because that's the population that we're dealing with, and that's the population that as we're aging, that we're dependent on.
No, thank you. It's great to see you, Terry. And I think it reminds me, I think you were involved, David Bradley. I think he was president then. So we, I don't know if it's almost 20 years ago now, we organized the symposium, The Idea of Newfoundland, ? And we had, I remember Ed Rich gave a paper. We had a whole weekend where we did exactly what you were talking about, Terry, is kind of reflecting on those things. And of course, we didn't really, it's hard to know then, no one had any crystal ball. We didn't know what we were living through, but it kind of reflecting on that transition moment. And I think maybe taking it for granted, because I think in a weird way, but the strength was both the weakness, the kinds of things which made Newfoundland and Labrador what it was, were also the things which created the problems and the limitations.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think, so the tremendous populism and this, as you said, all these stories that we have, which made us and created the culture, also created all the problems at the same time. And so the question is, when you preserve and want to continue, and this goes back to whether it's the legislature or partisan politics, and some of it was maybe functional, some of it it certainly, had some positive impacts. The question is how you selectively remember and maintain and preserve certain narratives and certain stories and certain traditions, and others, whether it's racism or sectarianism, which I think has long died off after the referendum in '97, and those other things. And getting back to Raymond's point about the rural-urban divide, which really did. It made for great stories and great humor, and at most high schools, lots of fights and battles, and depending on
global kids don't get too hoots about it.
And maybe that's all gone. And I think that if nothing else, at least, because your point is a really important one, a great point to finish up on tonight, it's still worth remarking upon, though, because most of the voters still remember. And if there's another generation coming up next, then maybe at least in terms of that transition to kind of talking about the decisions which are made, because when that younger generation goes to you or goes to me or goes to Heidi and say, well, why was this done? Can you please explain why there are $14 billion in the hole because of this boondoggle? Then at least you can explain it. and at least talk about the transition, and then have an informed transition about, okay, what's the thing that we keep? Do you keep the House of Assembly in its certain form? Do you keep the committee structure? Because I think your point is a good one, and something that, that's where an outsider like me, that's where I would have to stop at the door and realize, no, I don't know. And maybe when I will, next time when the bubble's reinflated, I won't recognize the place anymore. So what'll happen, you'll get people like me who move away, and I'll be like in a little one of those suspended animation bubbles, like a movie, and go back and stop someone on the street and they won't understand what I'm saying, because of, those changes are there, and it's kind of hard. I think you have to experience them. That's not the kind of stuff you're going to see on a website. But I think it is important at least to kind of talk about that change before rushing into another big monumental mega project, to talk about those things. And it's something, and again, I didn't address, and maybe it was a mistake on my part, is generational conflict. We talked about Indigenous settler conflict, or sectarianism, or as Raymond talked about, the rural versus urban. And I think one of the things that's maybe looming on the horizon, this gets back to Steve Wolenitz's point, is to have a serious intergenerational conversation between baby boomers, Gen Xers like myself, and then millennials. Because when debt is, the biggest form, in terms of borrowing and taxation, it's generational taxation. When you're running debts, and when you're adding adding to the debt, and you're taking annual deficits, for people my age, well, it's not going to be as big a deal when you're looking at just your life cycle, let alone your pension. So I think it really has to have an intergenerational discussion in terms of what the decisions that are made now, the people who are making those decisions are going to be long dead, right? It's that generational divide, which hasn't really been part of that dialogue. And maybe that's one way to at least start the debate. Anyways, great to see you. And it's a really good point to finish up on, probably the best point to finish up on anyways, thinking about generations, because, every time we open our mouths, we're dating ourselves. And so, and it was a lot of fun seeing so many familiar faces, and kind of reflecting on the discussions we've had, at least, because, my concern, and especially with the Historical Society, that's one of the things that the final thing that I'll do, Heidi, is to make a pitch, because I don't think you don't realize until you move away from Newfoundland, at least I didn't, how, the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society really is, I think, quite special and distinctive, that other provinces just don't have. You're not going to get, 150, 200 people in a room having the kind of vibrant debate, I just took it for granted. And, so it's one of those things when you look around and say, oh, well, the arse is out of her, everything is terrible. Well, you've got a vibrant public history and heritage sphere. So that's something, that's an asset.
Yeah, I remember one of my the first time I presented at the Historical Society, Thierry invited me at it was a healthcare symposium, and I was researching the history of nursing with the Grenfell Mission. And we got together and we did this presentation on healthcare, and a lot of it had to do with providing health services to rural Newfoundland and Labrador through the 20th century. And we were talking about nursing, outport nursing, and all of a sudden, Margaret Giovannini stood up in the audience, and it was a moment that it took my breath away. It was something, you study this as history, and you dig your teeth into it, and it means so much, and you have these important conversations about it, and then someone who lived it just is there in the audience, right? So it was really, I do miss the in-person events and the interactiveness and the energy from being together at Hampton Hall. As miserable as the last Thursday of every month always is, I guarantee. I miss those conversations after every lecture. And after the George Story lecture, there would always be a crowd coming up to talk to the speaker, and I miss that. And there's an energy we can't replace online, but we can reach people in the comfort of their own homes, wherever they are. So it's been great to have everybody this evening. Jerry, it's been great to have you. Your talk was engaging, and like I say, it gave me a lot to chew on, and I have a lot of opinions. And when you're home next, I think we're going to have to get a crowd together and get together for a conversation and explore this some more. I think that'd be great.
No, I'd really welcome that, Heidi. It's perfect. And thank you for kind of pulling those threads together so eloquently. So thank you to, and to John, Joy, and everyone in the executive as well, giving me this opportunity. It's been a lot of fun. And I would welcome that, Heidi. So when next time we get back, it'll be a chance to get together in a different venue. Thanks to everyone this evening. There's nothing else that I'm gonna, because Heidi just summed it up perfectly. So I don't know, what do you typically do? When I'm on meetings, we still do this waving thing. Isn't that weird?
We do the wave. Yeah.
It's kind of a
Yeah,
weird
we do the
thing.
wave.
Going to the governors is a lot better though, Jerry, I gotta
It is.
say.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna do the wavy thing. It's great to see so many friends. It's kind of sad too. It's kind of a little bit bittersweet. So hopefully it won't be too much longer. And I'll see you. And thank you so much for the
Yeah.
opportunity. It's for me, as a highlight of the year, and I really enjoyed. So thank you. It's a privilege to speak with all of you. All you had to do is just send me an email, and it's very simple. Just Jerry Bannister at Dal. If anyone wants to do follow up, and we'll try to get this paper out. We'll see. I've got a lot of work, even good questions tonight in terms of thinking what I'm going to do next. So thank you so much. Be safe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good
Thanks,
night.
Jerry.
Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody. Good night.
Good night.
But he's very much